This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and today I'm bringing you my Core Set 2021 Limited Archetype Guide. Over the last week or so I've been doing my set review where I gave my thoughts on every single card in Core Set 2021 individually. As usual, the Archetype Guide brings an end to Limited Review Week as the final video I make to get people ready for the new format. In this video, I'm going to talk about every single color pair in the set and one additional potential archetype. So this video is about discussing synergies within each color pair so that you can get a clear idea of how to value certain cards when you're in a specific color pair. Keep in mind, I'm not normally going to be talking about straight up bombs or premium removal type cards in this video, unless they have some specific synergy within a particular color pair. This video is more about the big picture, so it doesn't talk a whole lot about the cards that are just good in every deck. However, if you're interested in my thoughts on any cards in particular, that's what the limited set review is for. And keep in mind, the archetypes I'm talking about here are only for limited. I'm not talking about any constructed formats. Alright, let's get to our first color pair. So first let's look at red-white. So most color pairs in most sets these days have what is called a signpost uncommon, and that's how we're going to start talking about every single color pair in this set. The signpost uncommon is, well, an uncommon that tells you the direction that a specific color pair is going in, what its special synergies are, and in the case of red-white, we have Alpine Houndmaster, who is an aggressive creature as a 2-mana 2/2, and he gets bigger when he attacks with other creatures. He gets higher power, and he also has the additional upside of helping you search up creatures, in particular the two cards that I have on the screen here, Alpine Watchdog and Igneous Cur. You can potentially play him as a 2-mana 2/2 who searches up both of those cards if you have both of them in your deck. And in general, this will be the fastest, most aggressive deck in this format. It's all about playing a bunch of 1 and 2 drops, pumping your whole team, using combat tricks, using auras, and just beating the opponent down. Alpine Houndmaster sort of points you in the direction of aggro, but also in the direction of going wide a little bit, and he helps you go wide. You know, he doesn't make creature tokens, which is the more standard way to go wide, but by searching up 2 cards for you, he's helping you go wide. So let's look at the aggressive low drops in this set that are red or white at common or uncommon. So we have our friends Alpine Watchdog and Igneous Cur, who we can search up. There's also stuff like Anointed Chorister, who can get bigger in the late game. Daybreak Charger, a card which I think is going to be really good in this deck. It's a nice aggressive creature in terms of stats and happens to pump creatures when it comes down. Seasoned Hallowblade is another great aggressive creature, 2-mana 3/1. He's very difficult to kill because you can make him indestructible. Staunch Shieldmate gives you a highly efficient 1-drop as a 1-mana 1/3. Chandra's Magmut gives you a aggressive creature who can also give you a bit of reach by pinging your opponent. Chandra's Pyreling gains +1/+0 and double strike when you do non-combat damage to an opponent, which means out of nowhere it can do a bunch more damage. And by the way, Chandra's Magmut and her Pyreling do combo together. The Magmut doing damage to the opponent is non-combat damage, so that's going to be a pretty nasty thing. Goblin Arsonist is an aggressive 1-drop who, when it dies, deals 1 damage to any target. That also counts as non-combat damage for Chandra's Pyreling. Heartfire Immolator is a 2-mana 2/2 that also has prowess and the ability to sacrifice itself to kill things. Hobble Fiend is an aggressive 2-drop that can sacrifice other creatures to put counters on it, and it has trample. And Selfless Savior helps protect all your other creatures because it can give them indestructible, in addition to the fact that he's a 1-mana 1/1. So, those are the kind of cards that are going to be the best suited in this particular deck. It doesn't mean the deck won't be playing 3-drops and things like that. It certainly will, but these cards are all super aggressive and you want to be playing them early. This deck just wants to be curving out, turning cards sideways, and killing the opponent quickly, and it looks capable of that to me. So let's look at how you can go wide in this color pair. Well, we have our Houndmaster, who we mentioned. We also have Falconer Adept, who makes a bird token when it attacks. So if you support it with an aura or a combat trick, it's going to be particularly nasty. Valorous Steed makes 2 bodies with 1 card, and the same thing with Goblin Wizardry. And if you can go really wide, which means both making tokens with cards like these and just curving out, having a low number of lands in your deck, probably 15 or 16, and just curving out and then playing something that pays you off for the fact that you have way more creatures in play than your opponent. The payoffs for that we have are our friend the Houndmaster again, who gets bigger when other creatures attack with him. Bosri's Solidarity, which puts a counter on your whole board. Bosri's Acolyte, which isn't quite as huge of a go wide payoff as some of these, but it really does want you to be curving out, because when it comes down, it puts a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 other target creatures you control. So if you only have 1 creature in play when you play it on turn 4, it's only going to be able to put 1 counter on that creature. Makeshift Battalion likes attacking with friends. It gets a counter when it does. Siege Striker likes tapping down your creatures to hit the opponent harder. Warded Battlements pumps the power of all your creatures. Bolt Hound is a nice aggressive creature for this deck. This is definitely the best deck for it. It's got haste, and it pumps your whole board when it attacks. Burn Bright, I imagine this will really be the main deck for Burn Bright. It's a terrible card in most decks, but in this deck, going all in on aggro, trying to kill the opponent before they stabilize, something like Burn Bright, chipping in an extra 6 or 8 damage can get the job done. Some other things this deck is going to want to do that aren't always great things to do in most decks involves auras like Dub. It's not the only nice aggressive aura in the set, but it is a good one. Combat tricks like Sure Strike, and Shock. Obviously, Shock's good everywhere, but the reason I have Shock here is because this deck is not really going to want to be playing expensive removal spells that can kill anything. Instead, it's going to want nice, cheap removal spells that allow it to get blockers out of the way and keep bashing. And Shock in particular is nice because it can also go to the opponent's dome, which is good when you are attacking a lot and trying to get their life low. Most of the time, this deck is going to want to run combat tricks instead of straight up removal spells, though, because they are more efficient and they can also lead to you chipping in more damage. So what rares go best in this deck? Well, we've got Glorious Anthem, which pumps your whole team. This is going to be the most creature-heavy deck in the format on average, so Glorious Anthem is going to be good. Idol of Endurance is interesting. In a way, it kind of gives this deck a plan B. If your plan A of going all crazy on aggro doesn't work out, well, you can play Idol of Endurance late and get all your creatures back and play one of them every turn and hopefully kill your opponent that way. Subira Tulzidi Caravaner is probably the best rare for this deck. Well, maybe not. The Planeswalker Basri might be better, but Subira is crazy in this deck. She makes your small creatures unblockable, and she makes sure you reload your hand when you hit your opponent with small creatures, in addition to having reasonable stats and haste herself. So if you ever first pick her, you should probably try to go pretty hard into this deck. If it ends up not being open, you need to always remember to give up, but if it is open, she's going to be a huge boon for that deck. And yeah, I also have Basri Ket here. He can make your creatures bigger. If you're going really wide, his -2 is absurd and can just win the game on the spot. So Basri's great here. Pack Leader, also really good here, the Dog Lord. This is a color pair that has a fair bit of dogs in it. Red-white, actually maybe where all the dogs are in this set. But in addition to that, Pack Leader itself is just a great attacker. Even if you have 0 other dogs, which is unlikely. We saw a bunch of dogs on the earlier page. But even if you have 0 other dogs, it can't die in combat, basically. Not from combat damage anyway. And that means it's a free attack. So if you're playing auras or if you're playing combat tricks, he's going to get to be extra potent. And he'll just be silly if you happen to have more dogs around. So those are the rares that are best suited to this particular deck. Red-white, it's all about aggro. It's all about winning as quickly as you can before other decks can stabilize. Now let's move to green-white. Green-white, meanwhile, is all about +1/+1 counters. Here, our signpost uncommon is Conclave Mentor, who, if +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, adds an additional +1/+1 counter to that creature instead. That includes the Mentor itself, and you have some incentive to be putting counters on the Mentor because when it dies, you do gain life equal to its power. So this color pair, all about counters and payoffs for +1/+1 counters. Let's look at the common and uncommon cards that either put +1/+1 counters on your stuff or are payoffs for them. So we have our friend Basri's Acolyte again. You know, the Acolyte isn't only going to be good in one deck, and that's true of a lot of cards. They did a good job designing cards in this set that kind of overlap into multiple decks. As you'll see, we'll see Basri's Acolyte again in this video, because it's a common that gains you life, it's a common that puts counters on things, and it's a common that likes it if you're curving out. So that's 3 different decks that it really benefits in. Similarly, we have Basri's Solidarity again, which puts a counter on your whole board. That will be particularly absurd with the Signpost uncommon in play. Feat of Resistance is a good trick that puts a counter on one of your creatures. Makeshift Battalion, we've seen him already. He puts counters on himself when he attacks with lots of friends. Tempered Veteran is a straight-up +1/+1 counter payoff. So on this particular slide, I'm talking about not only cards that put counters on things, but also cards that are counter payoffs. And that's because all the cards that are counter payoffs also do something with counters anyway. So it's not just that they're plus and plus one counter payoffs. And Tempered Veteran's an example of that. Even if you have no other plus and plus one counters in your deck, it can start putting counters on things. But the real value from the Veteran comes from its ability to pay only 1 mana to put counters on creatures that already have counters, because that's extremely efficient. We also have Hunter's Edge, a removal spell that involves a plus and plus one counter. Invigorating Surge, which lets you double all the counters on one of your creatures. Pride Malkin, which puts a counter on something and gives trample to every creature you control that has a counter on it. So it's another card that is a payoff for counters, but also brings a counter along for the ride anyway. Quirion Dryad may not actually be at its best here because it's kind of a weird card. It wants you to be playing spells that are not green, even though it's green. And this deck will probably normally just be 2 colors, but if you have a deck that's like half white, half green, she's still pretty reasonable. I mean, if you can make her grow throughout the game, that's nice, and, she gets counters. Sabertooth Mauler gets a counter if a creature died on your turn. Truffle Snout can enter the battlefield with the counter. And Wildwood Scourge is a Hydra, so of course it involves counters, but in addition to that, if you put counters on other things when the Wildwood Scourge is in play, it also gains a counter. So it's another card that is simultaneously a payoff and has counters anyway. What rares go well in this deck? Well, we've got Bosri's Lieutenant, who, when your creatures with plus and plus one counters on them die, gives you a 2/2 White Knight creature token with Vigilance, and he comes into play and can put a counter somewhere too. We have Bosri Ket again. The -2 may be a little less effective in this deck than it is in the red-white one, but this deck will love the +1 because it puts a counter on something. Scavenging Ooze gains plus and plus one counters when it exiles creatures from graveyards, and Animal Sanctuary will be at its best in this deck. Green-white is where most of the cats and dogs are. It also adds counters to some other creature types, of course, but cat and dog are the most common ones on this card. There's also a decent number of birds in white. And it puts counters on things, so it's a really good card for this deck in particular. So, green-white, all about plus and plus one counters, making your creatures bigger and getting some extra bonuses out of it. Now let's move to black-red. In black-red, our signpost uncommon is Direfleet Warmonger, an efficient creature who, at the beginning of combat on your turn, can sacrifice another creature to become a 5/5 with trample that turn. So that's a pretty good incentive to be sacrificing things. Black-red is often a sacrifice deck. We see it pretty frequently. And the deck is all about finding good fodder to sacrifice and getting extra value out of sacrificing creatures. And Direfleet Warmonger is a good representation of that. So let's look at other ways to sacrifice stuff. So we have our Warmonger. We've also got Gormand, who asks you to sacrifice a creature when it comes into play, and it also makes your opponent sacrifice a creature, in addition to just being a huge flyer. We also have Liliana's Steward, which can sacrifice itself to make your opponent discard something. We've got Silver Smote Ghoul, who can sacrifice itself to draw cards. It's also not bad sacrifice fodder if you have a few ways to gain life, because it can keep coming back. Village Rite lets you sacrifice a creature to draw 2 cards. Witch's Cauldron lets you sacrifice creatures to gain 1 life and draw a card, and it's very repeatable. Heartfire Immolator can sacrifice itself to do damage to things. Hobble Fiend can sacrifice creatures to gain counters. Crypt Lurker can sacrifice creatures to draw cards. And Silent Dart is a bad removal spell, but one that does sacrifice itself. So if you have some sacrifice synergies, it might be worth it. So what kind of stuff do you want to be sacrificing here? Well, things like Deathbloom Thallid, which brings a Saproling along for the ride when it dies, so it gives you 2 bodies for 1 card. Liliana's Devotee, which works really well in this deck because if a creature dies on your turn, you can pay 1 and a black at the end of your turn to make a zombie token. So if you're sacrificing 1 thing a turn to Direfleet Warmonger and making a 2/2 zombie at the end of your turn, you're sort of giving him something to eat every turn to become an efficient attacker. Goblin Arsonist is nice to sacrifice because of its death trigger. Goblin Wizardry gives you 2 bodies for 1 card. Pitchburn Devils does 3 damage to any target when it dies, so it's not bad to sacrifice. Maybe one of the sweetest things to do in this type of deck is to steal your opponent's creature with Traitorous Greed, and then sacrifice that creature to one of your mini sacrifice outlets. That's devastating for opponents. So what are the payoffs for sacrificing? Well, we have things like Caged Zombie, which if a creature died on a turn, will allow you to use its activated ability. And if you're sacrificing things, well, a creature died on your turn. Malefic Scythe is a kind of awkward card in some ways, but it has a cheap enough equip cost that sometimes you'll want to just equip it to things you're going to sacrifice so that the Scythe can continue to become more potent. Keep in mind, it does have to be equipped to the creature for the Scythe to get a soul counter, but again, it only costs 1 mana. You might have the mana laying around to do it anyway, and when you do, it's going to become an increasingly oppressive equipment. Next up, it's Liliana's Devotee, who we already looked at, but, he also synergizes well with sacrificing. He might be one of the best things for sacrificing, again, because if you sacrifice something during your turn, at the end of your turn, you can pay 1 and a black and get a zombie, and it sort of starts a cycle. Havoc Jester is the only card that's like a straight-up sacrifice payoff that says, when you sacrifice a permanent X happens. But man, it's a good one. It's a highly efficient creature as a 5-mana 5/5, and it can do 1 damage to anything when you sacrifice things. What rares go well in this deck? Well, we've got Liliana's Standard Bearer, who draws you more cards the more creatures die in your turn, and Gadrak the Crown Scourge, who creates a treasure every turn for every creature who dies. So that means if you're sacrificing things, he's going to be giving you treasure. But in addition to that, if you get enough treasure, he can attack, and he's a scary, efficient creature. And in addition to that, if you have like Havoc Jester, you can actually sacrifice treasure for free, no mana cost. And when you do that, you're going to be in business with your Havoc Jester because it'll just be doing 1 to things for 0 mana. In fact, you get mana out of the deal, which is pretty insane. So that's it for Black-Red, which is all about sacrificing. Next up, it's a sort of parallel deck, the Black-Green deck, which I'm calling Morbid. And that's because even though the Morbid keyword isn't in this set, a bunch of cards in the set basically have it. And the Morbid keyword, if you're not familiar, basically just means a card gives you extra value if a creature died this turn. So Twin Blade Assassins, for example, if a creature died this turn, you get to draw a card. And that happens, any turn. Well, it has to be your turn, because it's only at the beginning of your end step, but you get to draw a card if things have died on your turn. And there are several other cards in Black-Green that give you extra value if something has died on a given turn. So we've got Twin Blade Assassins. We also have Caged Zombie, who we already saw. He likes it when things are sacrificed, but he also likes it when things die for any reason, just like this deck does. Liliana's Devotee, pretty much the same thing. He may be a little bit better in the sacrifice deck, because he gives you sort of an endless source of zombies. Canopy Stalker, when things die and it dies in the same turn, you gain 1 life for each creature that died this turn. Fungal Rebirth gives you 2 Saprolings in addition to its effect if a creature died on the turn you cast it. Note, by the way, that for Fungal Rebirth, it doesn't matter if the creature died on your opponent's turn or your turn. You can cast it on either turn, whereas something like Twin Blade Assassins only counts your turn. It's kind of annoying. It's not 100% consistent, but there you go. Sabertooth Mauler, like Twin Blade Assassins, only counts your turn, but it gets a counter at the end of your turn if a creature died during your turn. Life Goes On gains you more life if a creature died on the turn. So how do you trigger Morbid? Well, you can do it through sacrificing. And this is why Black-Red and Green-Black sort of overlap with each other, because you have all these black sacrifice cards that are good in both decks. You have Crypt Lurker, who can have you give up a creature in play when it comes in to draw you a card. Gourmand, who does, we've already seen it, makes you sacrifice something and your opponent. Village Rites lets you cash in a creature for cards. Witch's Cauldron, endless source of sacrificing stuff. Portcullis Vine can sacrifice itself to draw a card. Liliana's Steward, we've already seen, can sacrifice itself. Same with Silver Smoke Ghoul. And keep in mind, too, you can trigger Morbid in other ways. If your deck just has a bunch of removal, you can trigger it that way. But these are cards that give you some control over triggering Morbid. So what rares go well here? Well, we again have the Standard Bearer, who is good in Black-Red. Draws you more cards, the more things that have died on a given turn. And Scavenging Ooze doesn't technically have Morbid. It doesn't have that effect. But if you're a deck that is triggering Morbid a lot, you're probably losing creatures, and so is your opponent. And Scavenging Ooze likes to eat creatures in the graveyard and become larger. So that's Black-Green. It's all about sort of getting the extra value out of creatures dying. Right, let's move to Blue-Red. Blue-Red is about spells, which it often is, and the Signpost Uncommon here is a powerful one. They're all powerful, frankly, but I like this one a lot. And Experimental Overload lets you return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand, and also makes a blue and red weird creature token, where X is the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. So you are creating a token and getting a card back from your graveyard, and that is a 2-for-1. This color pair, all about spells. It is another kind of weirdly inconsistent color pair in terms of what exactly it pays you off for, and I'll explain what I mean when we see that. But for the most part, it's about instants and sorceries, but also a little bit about any non-creature spell. So we've got Experimental Overload, which only cares about instants and sorceries, so keep that in mind. We've also got Jeskai Elder. Now, Prowess is back in this set, and that's where things get a little complicated, because Prowess triggers on any non-creature spell. It doesn't matter whether it's an instant or a sorcery. So Jeskai Elder likes all non-creature spells, whereas Experimental Overload only likes instants and sorceries. Same thing with Mistral Singer, a nice efficient flyer with Prowess. Riddle Form also cares about non-creature spells, not just instants and sorceries. It becomes a 3/3 flyer when you play one of those. Shipwreck Dowser is interesting because it has Prowess, which means it cares about non-creature spells, but its Enter the Battlefield ability only gets instants or sorceries. Vidalian Arcanist makes your instants or sorceries a little easier to cast because it gives you mana for them. Heartfire Immolator, another card with Prowess, so it cares about all non-creature spells. Kinetic Augur cares mostly about instants and sorceries in particular, and it also gives you some card selection. Spellgorger Weird, we're back on non-creature spells. So something to remember is just make sure you're reading your cards and you're aware of which ones care about what. Because if you're sort of thinking about Experimental Overload as also counting all your non-creature spells, which it does not, that could get you into trouble. But for the most part, most of the cards in this set are happy with any non-creature spell, but a few of them are very specific about instants and sorceries. So what rares go well in this deck? Well, you have Chandra Heart of Fire, who is frankly a bomb, but in this particular deck, it's going to be at its best mostly because the ultimate should have lots of instants and sorceries to find and cast. Chandra's Incinerator turns all of your red burn spells into damage you can also do to your opponent's creature. It also gets cheaper the more damage you've done to your opponent, non-combat damage you've done to your opponent. And by the way, I didn't show you every single instant and sorcery in this set because, frankly, it's obvious that those are all going to be good here, and so are some non-creature spells. But Chandra's Incinerator has a few different cards that can help it be cheaper, and cards that it can turn into damage to the opponent and damage to one of their creatures. Stormwing Entity is cheaper to cast if you cast an instant or sorcery spell, so it cares about instants and sorceries specifically, but it also has Prowess, which cares about non-creature spells more generally. You also have Double Vision, another card specifically about instants or sorceries. It lets you copy the first one you cast each turn. So that's Blue-Red. It is all about spells, as it often is. Next up, we've got Black-White, which is about life gain. The Signpost in common here is a creature who has lifelink and flying, but the thing that really pushes you into gaining life here is the fact that anytime you gain 3 or more life in a turn, your opponent loses 3 life. So it isn't just about gaining life. As we'll see, a lot of the life gain payoffs are specifically about gaining 3 or more life. So you have to go kind of hard on life gain, but you get an insane payoff like the Patrician, who basically lightning helixes your opponent. And remember, the Patrician's lifelink counts towards you gaining life. So in addition to the 1 damage it can do, you can also find a way to gain 2 extra life. So let's look at the life gain payoffs. We've got our Patrician, of course. There's also Sanguine Indulgence, which becomes cheaper if you've gained 3 or more life in a turn. Silver Smoke Ghoul, we've seen him a few times. This is probably where he'll be at his best because this deck will be able to return him from the graveyard to the battlefield with regularity, which is not going to be good news, unless you're the one playing it. We have our Patrician. Griffin Airy is another very powerful uncommon for this color pair, a good payoff. If you gain 3 or more life in a turn, it makes a 2/2 white Griffin creature token, and that is pretty awesome. There's also Light of Promise, which I don't love, but in the interest of mentioning all of the life gain payoffs, it is one of those. So you'll notice that this particular color pair has most of its payoffs at uncommon. Its best payoffs certainly are. Silver Smoke Ghoul, Indulging Patrician, and Griffin Airy are going to be the key payoffs for this deck. Sanguine Indulgence is nice, but it's not a key payoff. So you are kind of reliant on uncommons here, so keep that in mind and value them highly if it looks like you're going to be in the life gain deck. So how do you gain life? Well, we have things like Tricks that can give lifelink. We have Archfiend's Vessel, a creature with lifelink. Blood Glutton, a creature with lifelink who can single-handedly help you trigger one of your gain 3 life or more triggers because it's a 4/3. Gloom Sower, which can drain your opponent when they block it. Witch's Cauldron, which we've already seen, gains you a little bit of life. So sometimes you're going to have to sort of cobble 3 life together in an attempt to trigger things. And cards like Witch's Cauldron can help you find your way there. We've got Avon Gagglemaster, who on its own is going to gain 2 life when it comes into play. If you have other flyers, it can also trigger the gain 3 life or more thing on its own. Basri's Acolyte again, a creature with lifelink. Faith's Fetters, a powerful removal spell that also just so happens to trigger your gain 3 life or more things right away. Tavern Swindler's kind of a funny card because you don't always gain the life from it, but when you do, it can trigger your gain 3 life things. Revitalize gains you the exact amount of life you need and replaces itself. Sanctum of Stone Fangs drains your opponent for 1 life every turn on its own, and if you get more than 1 shrine, it can do more than that. Scoured Barons and the rest of the gain lands are going to be a little better in this deck than in most because of the life they gain you. Same thing for Radiant Fountain, though I think most of the time, unless you're really desperate for ways to gain life because you have all the best payoffs and not enough ways to gain life, I don't think you want to play the Fountain because it's pretty bad for your mana base. Alright, so what are the rares that are best suited for this deck? Well, you have Hooded Blightfang, who lights creatures with Death Touch, including itself, and it makes them all attack, and when they attack, they drain their opponent. Veto Thorn of the Dusk Rose is maybe the ideal rare for this set because of the fact that it has an insane payoff of anytime you gain life, your opponent loses that much life, and he can give lifelink to your whole board. Baneslayer Angel is a bomb in any deck, but it does have lifelink, so I included it here. Mungara the Diplomat, also going to be good in pretty much any deck, but it does have lifelink. Speaker of the Heavens is specifically a life gain payoff, but one that's going to be hard to achieve. He does have lifelink himself as well, but you have to have at least 7 life more than your starting life total to use his ability, and if you do get to use his ability even once, it's going to be insane. It's not impossible, it just won't be as easy as it might seem, because you have to have 27 life, and that's not always easy to make happen in Limited. Maze Mind Tome, when it runs out of page counters, it's exiled and it gains you 4 life, so it will trigger your things that care about gaining life. So that's Black-White, it's all about life gain. Let's move now to Red-Green. So Red-Green, like Black-Green, is basically built around a keyword that isn't actually in this set, and that is Ferocious. Ferocious in the past has given you bonuses for having a creature in play with power 4 or greater. So that's the main focus here, creatures with high power. And Leafkin Avenger is good at conveying that in a number of ways. It can tap for green mana for each creature with power 4 or greater, which includes itself, and the fact that it has power 4 on its own means it also helps you get other payoffs. And if you have a bunch of mana lying around, which you might because you can actually use the mana you tap the Avenger for to pay for the ability, it also does damage equal to its power to a player or planeswalker. So what are the Ferocious payoffs? Well, the Avenger. Also Furious Rise, a reprint from the recent past that basically draws you an extra card on your instep every turn if you have a power 4 or greater creature in play. Turret Ogre, which does 2 damage to each opponent if you have a creature with power 4 or greater in play. It also is, a 4 power creature. Unleash Fury, I don't love this card. In fact, I would say I don't like it, and I'm not planning on playing it personally. It's too risky, it doesn't help your creatures win combat, and that's really annoying. You really have to hope the creature gets through, and that's not usually something you want to be hoping for. But if there's anywhere it works out, it'll be this deck, because it cares the most about high power. So Fierce Empath isn't actually a Ferocious payoff. It specifically wants cards with converted mana cost 6 or greater. So it's looking for something a little different, but something that this deck will be the best at finding, which is big creatures. Garruk's Uprising gives you a second enchantment in addition to Furious Rise to give you card advantage off of the fact that you have big creatures, and it also gives all your creatures trample, which will be nice with power 4 creatures. Hunter's Edge, also not technically a Ferocious payoff, but it's going to be at its best in a deck with high power, and that's what this deck's about. Ornery Dilophosaur becomes larger when it attacks if you have a creature with power 4 or greater. Drowsing Pteranodon can attack if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. So how do we get to Ferocious? Well, we have our Leafkin Avenger. We've also got Burlfist Oak, who on your turn will at least be a 4/5. Canopy Stalker, who has the 4 power you're looking for. Colossal Dreadmaw, which has a lot more than 4 power. Garruk's Gorehorn, not a card I love, but it does have high power. Gnarled Sage, another 4 power creature. Warden of the Woods, another 4 power creature. Battle Rattle Shaman on your turn can be a 4 power creature on his own, and he can also raise the power of your other creatures if he needs to. Bone Pit Brute helps make your other creatures big for a turn, one of your other creatures big for a turn. and has 4 power on its own. We've also got Havoc Jester, which probably better in the sacrifice deck, but it's a huge efficient creature. Onake Ogre is a nice cheap creature that gets to 4 power. So what rares are best suited for this deck? Well, you have Volcanic Salvo, which becomes cheaper the higher the total power of your creatures is, and that's great. And you have Primal Might, which is a fight removal spell that scales as the game goes on, and the bigger your creature is, the more effective Primal Might will be. So that's red-green. It's about big creatures, specifically 4 or more power. So let's move now to blue-green, which is all about drawing extra cards. Our Signpost Uncommon here is actually a reprint, and it's a creature that gets a +1/+1 counter anytime you draw a card. So that's what this deck's about, drawing extra cards and getting extra value out of them. So what other payoffs are there for drawing cards at common and uncommon? Well, you've got the Coatl, but you also have Teferi's Tutelage, which can be a real win condition in this format, I think. If you're good enough at drawing cards, you can mill your opponent out. Tolarian Kraken, which lets you pay 1 mana anytime you draw a card to tap something. Tome Anima, which specifically can't be blocked as long as you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn. Sort of like it was awkward in blue-red that not all of the payoffs actually do the exact same thing. There are a few cards that specifically ask you to draw 2 or more cards to get their benefit, but the rest of them that we've already looked at, like the Coatl, the Tutelage, and the Kraken, even if you're only drawing 1 card a turn with them, you get some trigger out of them, but that's not true with Tome Anima, so keep that in mind. Burl Fist Oak also counts every single time you draw a card, not just the second card, so if you can draw additional cards at instant speed, it can become huge out of nowhere. Gnarled Sage is another one that specifically asks you to draw 2 or more cards, and when you do, it gets +0/+2 and has Vigilance. So how do you draw extra cards? Well, with stuff like Library Larcenist, who draws a card when it attacks, or Opt, which will be extra good in this set because of this deck and the blue-red deck. Reign of Revelation drawing you 3 cards can be particularly absurd with cards like the Coatl that count every card you draw. Read the Tide, same thing. It can draw you 3 cards. It's also got nice modality to bounce things if that's what you need. Rousing Reed is a nice aura that also draws you cards. Sanctum of Calm Waters is the blue shrine, and it lets you loot every turn on its own. Teferi's Protege also helps you loot. Garruk's Uprising, we saw before, probably going to be better in the red-green deck where you have more power 4 or greater. But in this deck, you have creatures like the Coatl who can get big as a result of drawing cards, and thus maybe Garruk's Uprising will be useful here. Llanowar Visionary draws you a card when it comes down. Portcullis Vine can draw you a card. Setessan Training is a good aura that also happens to draw you a card. Track Down is sort of like a green Anticipate, except it actually draws you a card the way it's worded, unlike Anticipate, which does not. Warden of the Woods is a nice late-game creature who also happens to draw you cards should your opponent ever target it with something. Frantic Inventory draws you extra cards, and it draws you more extra cards the more frantic inventories you have. Sky Scanner draws you a card when it comes into play. So what are the rares that are well suited to this deck? Well, you have Teferi's Ageless Insight, which once you start drawing extra cards on your turn, draws you extra cards. Maze Mine Tome, we've already seen, it can draw you cards. Jolry Almond Volley Recluse is another card that checks to see if you're drawing your second card in a turn, and when you do, she makes a cat creature token, which is pretty sweet. And Teferi's going to be good in pretty much any deck, but the fact that he can loot on your turn and then on your opponent's turn means that he can really help make creatures in this, and cards in general with that trigger, a lot better. So that's blue-green. It's about drawing extra cards. Next up, it's blue-black, which is all about the graveyard. Our Signpost Uncommon here actually helps you loot. It helps you rip through your deck and put things in your graveyard that you want there. And then in the later part of the game, she can sacrifice herself to reanimate a creature from your graveyard. So she can help you set up some silly reanimations by helping you fill your graveyard in the first place, and then she can reanimate the creature. What other graveyard synergies do we have? Well, we have our Stitcher, we have the inventory, so if you end up milling or discarding frantic inventories, your later inventories will be better. So also Archfiend's Vessel, which if you can reanimate it, like you can with the Stitcher, comes back and gives you a 5/5 black demon creature token. There's also Carrion Grub, who can both mill your deck, something you want to do in this deck anyway, and also likes for cards to be in your graveyard because its power is equal to the highest power among creature cards in your graveyard. And there's also Rise Again, which is a reanimation spell, another one you can use on Archfiend's Vessel. There's Silver Smoke Ghoul, who we've seen a lot already, but while he's probably best in the life gain deck, he can come back from the graveyard, and this deck likes that. There's also Epitaph Golem, which is kind of a silly card, but If your deck is really good at loading the graveyard and ripping through your deck, you can use the Epitaph Golem as a super late game payoff to just redraw the best cards in your library over and over. That sounds far-fetched, but it is something we've actually seen with Epitaph Golem before, so keep that in mind. How do you load the graveyard? Well, we've seen Reign of Revelation. It lets you put one card in your graveyard in addition to the Reign of Revelation. Rousing Reed, which allows you to discard a card. All the looters are going to be good here, so that means Teferi's Protege. Waker of Waves is interesting because you can sort of cycle it. It's actually a little better than cycling what it does because it gives you a little bit of card selection, and you get to put one of those cards into the graveyard and one of them into your hand. But in addition to all of that, this color pair does have one uncommon reanimation spell and one common one. So sometimes I think we're going to see what we saw in Ikoria, cycling away a big creature and then reanimating it later. That's going to happen with Waker of Waves. Kyrian Grub, we've already seen, helps you load the graveyard. Sanctum of Calm Waters lets you loot every turn. So what rares are the best suited for this deck? Well, Ghostly Pilferer lets you discard cards, so he goes well here. Demonic Embrace is nice because if you mill it, you can still get it back and put it on things. And Liliana's -3 is at its best the more cards there are in your graveyard. So that's blue-black. It's all about your graveyard. Let's move now to our last color pair, which is blue-white. And it's all about flyers, also known as blue-white skies. Here, the Signpost Uncommon is a flyer. It reduces the cost of flyers, and when a creature with flying enters the battlefield, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So what flying payoffs do we have? Well, we've got Lofty Denial, which becomes a better counterspell if you control a flyer. We've got Tide Skimmer, which draws you a card when 2 or more creatures with flying attack. We have the Aven Gagglemaster, who gains you 2 life for each creature you control with flying. Celestial Enforcer, whose ability can only be used if you control a creature with flying. Here, sort of like we saw in Black-White, the best payoffs are definitely uncommon, so keep that in mind. Let's look now at the flyers in blue and white, at common and uncommon. So we've got Keen Glidemaster, who can give flying to anything, which is nice. Kind of expensive to do, but he does do it. Mistral Singer, we've seen before, flyer with prowess. Roaming Ghostlight is a flying mana war. It's pretty great. Rousing Reed can make any creature gain flying and +1/+1. Concordia Pegasus, a 2-mana 1/3 flyer. Falconer Adept can make 1/1 white bird creature tokens. Gale Swooper can give a creature flying when it comes into play, and it has flying itself. And Vryn Wingmare can fly, and it also increases the cost of non-creature spells. Sky Scanner also is a flyer. And if any deck can make Angelic Ascension work, it's probably this one because you can cash in smaller creatures for a big flyer, and this deck likes flyers. So what rares are best suited for this deck? Well, Stormwing Entity goes pretty well here. Reducing its cost may not be as easy, but it's a nice efficient creature anyway. Shacklegeist is an aggressive flyer. And this color pair is also where you have access to the most spirits, so that second ability will be the most relevant here. And Baneslayer Angel also has flying. So those are the 10 color pairs and what they're up to in this set, but there is one more deck that I want to talk about. And that's the Shrine deck. So we've seen a few shrines throughout this video. Every color has one uncommon shrine, and all the shrines, like other shrines, they become more powerful the more shrines that you have in play. And I think this is going to be a very real deck. This assumption is based on the fact that the last time we saw a bunch of shrines, which was Kamigawa block, it was a pretty legitimate deck. And it's also based on how powerful some of these are. In particular, I think the blue, black, and green one are quite good. The green one, Sanctum of Fruitful Harvest, fixes for you, so it helps you play the other ones. Sanctum of Stone Fangs is going to be your main win condition. It just drains the opponent equal to the number of shrines you have in play every turn. And Sanctum of Calm Waters helps you rip through your deck and turns into actual card advantage as long as you have 2 shrines in play. After that, I would say the red Sanctum is not so good. It's super underwhelming. You have to have more than 1 shrine in play for it to really be doing its job. It's still playable in this deck and fine. I just don't think it's one of the shrines you really seek out. And Sanctum of Tranquil Light is similar. You can use it as a kind of removal, but it is kind of expensive. I mean, even if you have 3 shrines in play, paying 3 every turn to tap something isn't the most awesome rate. So how does this deck work? How do you get into it? Well, I think the answer to that is that if you see a bunch of shrines wheeling, you should start considering taking them. Especially, the black one is the one that's the best on its own. So picking up that one might be kind of hard. But if you start seeing shrines late and, the other cards in the pack that you're looking at are all sort of mediocre, try taking a shrine and see what happens. Because this seems to me like it's going to be a pretty legitimate multicolor deck. I do think you don't necessarily need to go all 5 colors. I think you can get away with 3, and I think to really get there, You need at least 3 shrines, and you probably want more like 4 or 5. So what are you looking for in this deck in addition to shrines? Well, the answer to that is that you should start really highly valuing fixing, so it's easier for you to play all these shrines. You of course have Sanctum of Fruitful Harvest, but there are some other cards that you should be after too, like Cultivate, a good card for most decks because it helps them splash, but it's extra good here. There's also Meteorite, a card that most people won't be that interested in playing, but you should be in this deck. Those are the only 2 common or uncommon pieces of fixing in the set, believe it or not, which is kind of crazy, in addition to, of course, the green shrine. So fixing isn't awesome in this set in terms of non-lands, but there is enough fixing in the lands in this set, which we'll talk about in a moment, that I still think this is doable. Solemn Simulacrum is going to be good in any deck, but it also is extra good here because of the fixing. Fabled Passage, same thing. Most decks are happy to have it, extra good here. Then you have the gain lands at common, and I think those are going to be really key here. You're going to want to value those pretty highly once you have your 3, 4, or 5 shrines, so go after them when you can. There's also the rare temples, so those also are nice fixing. You'll notice I didn't talk about the 5-color shrine, and that's because actually making it work seems pretty impossible, has an impossible mana cost. It only gets really good when you have 6 or more shrines in play, which just won't happen in Limited. So I'm not talking about it here. So that's the shrine deck. It is kind of a wild card deck, a deck that won't always pan out, but when it does, it's probably going to be pretty sweet. All right, well, that does it for the Archetype Guide. This limited review might be over now, but I make limited content all year long, including draft videos of this format in the near future. If you want to make sure you catch future content, including set reviews, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And if you want to watch any other videos from the Core Set 2021 set review, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.